A startling health ministry report confirms what we already knew. Hamas subjects hostages to systematic torture and abuse. Yet some, including UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, blur the lines, even comparing Israel to its attackers. At the same time, global media, along with their useful idiots here in Israel, spread lies faster than Israel can respond to them. Is there any way to get ahead of the narrative before it shapes the world's view? Today, we break down the battle for truth and what Israel must do to win it.
Shalom and welcome to another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. I'm Mark Regev and I'm here as per usual with my co-host, Ruthie Blum. How are you today, Ruthie?
I'm pretty good, although, it's 104 degrees in Jerusalem today. So everybody, the weather is the main topic of discussion. It even overtook the war. But I would like to start right off the bat by mentioning the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu has given a few press conferences and interviews this week. He gave in English and in Hebrew. And one of the questions he's asked, and you and I are always asked this question by readers and by people we know outside of Israel: why is Israel's PR so bad? Or how come lies are spread and Israel takes so long to refute the lies? And that could be the starvation campaign in Gaza and what we'll get to other lies about sexual assault that soldiers ostensibly committed against Nukhba terrorists. And so I think we need to discuss, is it because we have bad PR, or is it something else?
So maybe I'll answer that through a story. It was the first 2-3 weeks of the war, and Israel had just started its operation inside Gaza. As you will recall, the first few days of the war, we were playing defense. We were trying to clean out our territory because the terrorists were still active on our side of the frontier. And after that, we went into Gaza. And I remember in that first week or two, there was a story, and you will remember this well, of a so-called Israeli missile strike on a hospital, on a yard outside a hospital that had apparently killed. The numbers kept going up, but one number said 300, another number said 500 innocent civilians who'd been by the hospital had been killed by Israeli fire. And this was all over the news agencies. This was all over the television news networks. And all these reports out of Gaza saying that Gaza Ministry of Health is reporting this massacre by Israel of all these innocent civilians, all of them women and children, outside this hospital in northern Gaza. And I was called upon then, I was working for the government at the time, to address this issue. And you ring up the military, and what's going on here? There are all these charges. And they say, well, we're looking into it. We're investigating. But the other side, the Gaza Ministry of Health, was saying, 100%, we know exactly what happened. The Israelis bombed a hospital and killed all these innocent civilians, women and children. Now, luckily, within hours, we discovered that these were actually missiles that were fired by Hamas and or Islamic Jihad, by the terrorists. They were aimed at Israel. They fell short and landed outside the hospital, killing people. And the numbers were much, much, much less. So I think they were talking about like 30 people were killed, but it wasn't by Israeli fire at all. And I think this is the essential problem that Israel faces. That Gaza Ministry of Health, which people think, oh, that's like the Ministry of Health where I live in Canada or Australia or the United States. Yes, it must be an objective, health bureaucracy. No, it's controlled by Hamas. Puts out extreme statements. Anything that happens, it's always Israel's fault. They'll exaggerate the numbers. They'll always say it's all women and children because that's the Hamas line. And the media believes it. And while Israel is checking out and trying to find the facts and exactly what happened, it's all Hamas's field day, because the best the Israelis can say in those first minutes, yes, where we don't know exactly what happened, is we're looking into it. We can say we don't target, innocent civilians, but to say that we know exactly what happened when we don't say, but the other side has no problem. That, I think, in a nutshell, shows you what our problem is. The other side will lie. The other side will just, run with a story that they think is good for them. And we, in Israel, try to trick our facts. We don't want to say things that we know for a fact are not true.
And we've even gone as far as to apologize for events that happened inadvertently. We never targeted civilians, but when something happened that was our fault, inadvertently, we did apologize. The army apologized. By the way, many Israelis said, "Why are we apologizing? This is wartime, and in any case, we're not committing war crimes the way we're being accused of doing." But another interesting part about casualties is, do you realize that on October 7th, we know now there were 1,200 people, Israelis and foreign nationals, murdered that day, slaughtered, not just murdered, slaughtered, raped, beheaded, all kinds of horrible deaths they suffered, both on the kibbutzim in the south and also at the Nova Music Festival. But it took us a long time to do a body count. For one thing, there were bodies tied together, burned. They had to go through strict forensic testing, and it took a while. They had to be brought to the labs and all this. So I remember at the time saying, it's interesting that Hamas says there's some bombing, and they said this many hundred of Palestinians were killed by Israel. And I'm thinking, that's interesting. A bomb hits, and 5 minutes later, they know how many people were killed. We're still working on the forensics to determine who was killed in Israel.
Can I add to that one point? I remember that specifically, our original estimations were actually a little higher than the ultimate number, and we took the number down. Can you imagine the other side, the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health in Gaza, actually taking down their numbers?
Never. Well, they took the number down when it turned out it was their own missile that hit the hospital.
Okay.
Then the number went way down. Okay. But okay, that's an example of how we have to be responsible and they don't. But then that brings us to the question of, okay, but because of that, that's one thing. They're terrorists, okay? And Iran, their backer, and Qatar, their other backer, they have no problem with that. Qatar owns Al Jazeera network, which is there to smear Israel and hope for its destruction, etc. But why does the West have to automatically believe terrorist propaganda over Israeli verification? So yes, it's true, we've got to get ahead of the story. But let me ask you something. How did we know that Hamas was going to come out with this false report about Israel purposely starving Gazans, using famine as a weapon of war, which was totally false? All Israel did was try to separate the civilians from the Hamas terrorists, because Hamas was stealing all the food, selling it. It was its meal ticket, both literally and figuratively, because the Hamas terrorists were all eating up, feasting. We have videos of it, etc. But also selling it to keep their, weapons, to keep buying weapons and all that. And why are Israel's allies in Europe and Canada the only ally we have that repeatedly remained on our side, believing our side of these outrageous lies, was the United States? Everybody else jumped to take what Hamas says at face value, and throughout the war, by the way.
Can I tell you something you don't know, Ruthie? I have to inform you that Hamas is not a democratic movement, and that Hamas controls Gaza with an iron fist, that Hamas has, over its nearly 2-decade years in power until October 7th, yes? Hamas rules Gaza not just authoritarian, but because it's an authoritarian regime with a very, very strong ideology, you could even say in a totalitarian way. There is no independent civil society inside Gaza. There is no independent media. And all the Western media who have offices in Gaza, those offices are staffed by local Gazan journalists. And what is a journalist in an authoritarian/totalitarian society? They are mouthpieces for the regime. Otherwise, they wouldn't have their jobs. That's the bottom line. And so if you look at all these journalists who work for, I don't know, the BBC, CNN, AP, Reuters in Gaza, they cannot report things that would get them into trouble with the Hamas authorities. And if they get into trouble with the Hamas authorities, they might not have a job, they might not have a life, their families might suffer. They live in an authoritarian society. Hamas is not a vegetarian. If they think they don't like you, they will take care of you. And there will be retribution if you report something that they don't like. There was once a reporter that Hamas didn't like. They said they were counting bodies of civilians because Hamas terrorists who were wearing civilian gear were being counted as civilian casualties. And it was reported, in the end, the agency that reported that had to delete the report. They didn't say that there's Hamas censorship because that no one can say that. But there was retribution immediately, and their reporter would have been facing violent retribution unless the story was cleaned up. A person who studied this much more closely than I have said there are three types of journalists in Gaza. One, people who sympathize with Hamas. Two, people who fear Hamas and therefore toe the party line. And three, people who are actually Hamas. They are Hamas. They're part of the Hamas structure. And so you have a situation where all the Hamas claims, all the Hamas allegations are amplified through the correspondents in Gaza, not because they're necessarily bad people, but because they work in the framework of an authoritarian regime. And then that becomes the message that goes out to Western media. And if Hamas's party line is people are dying of starvation, everyone will say it. Just as everyone said, the hospital that I spoke about a moment ago, it was Israeli missiles, everyone repeats it because that is the party line.
Okay, but you have... Take the New York Times, for example, all right? We now know that the New York Times, the editorial staff of the New York Times, discovered that the two photos, early on, that the two photos of these young boys ostensibly having been starved to near death by Israel, because their bones were showing, they were very, very emaciated. The New York Times, before these photos were published on the cover of the New York Times, the editors discovered that these two children were they actually had a severe genetic disease, and that's why they looked like that. And that one of them, even Israel helped take to a hospital in Italy. And they also photoshopped out of another one, the sibling who was perfectly healthy looking. And in another photo we saw, the mother was quite fat and the baby was emaciated. So, but the editors did catch it. And they said, okay, well, so bring us photos of, since there's so many starving people in Gaza, give us the real photos. We can't use photos of children who aren't being starved to death. We have to be accurate. And guess what? The photographers couldn't find photos of emaciated women and children. And therefore, but then the New York Times ran it anyway. And when it apologized, it put it on the website in a very...
So I don't know the details of what happened inside the New York Times.
Yes, we know that now.
I will say the following. It's clear that the visual images coming out of Gaza by the photojournalists who work inside Gaza, all those visual images have to be in accordance with the Hamas line. And they don't take pictures of things they're not allowed to take pictures of. I'll give you an example from a previous round of fighting. I remember it well. We would say in Israel they are shooting out of built-up areas and using the civilians as human shields. And people would say, well, there's no evidence of that. Israel says that, but is it true? And there were these two Indian journalists who came into Gaza and actually found the pictures. Accidentally, they woke up in their hotel room on the first morning that they were in Gaza, and they actually saw the two terrorists from Hamas shooting rockets from just outside the hotel, using all the journalists in the hotel as a human shield. Do you remember that story?
I do remember it.
And then those pictures were picked up by CNN and BBC, and then you have to ask the question, why did all the big agencies and the big networks that have offices in Gaza, they never got the pictures? Because the journalists in Gaza, authoritarian regime, know what they can take pictures of, And what they're not allowed to take pictures on, and of course, those 2 Indian journalists had to leave Gaza straight away because they were told they were not wanted, precisely because they took pictures that they're not supposed to take. I'd ask you the following question. Since this war has started, have you seen literally thousands of pictures of injured or dead civilians killed by Israel? Have you seen a single picture of a dead Hamas fighter? One picture of a dead Hamas fighter?
I'll go further than that. All you see in the photos from Gaza and video footage, all you see is rubble. Okay? You see rubble as though they're just all of Gaza is in ruins, right? Now, then you might ask yourself, interesting, so how do all these Gazans, where are they charging their iPhones to take the pictures that they're also posting and sending? Interesting. What you never see, unless the army releases it here and there, but you never see, for example, Gaza City, where this is the last stronghold. We can talk about that later, about how the Israeli government has decided now we've got to take over Gaza City and the central camps, the last bastion of, Hamas, the last strongholds. Gaza City is completely built up. There are shops, there are roads, it looks like normal, all right? But that's not the only place. We see markets in other places in Gaza where there's fruit, where there are restaurants. There's a jewelry store with Rolex watches being sold, okay? So that you don't see. That's number one. But my question, I would like to go back to my original question was, okay, we know that the journalists do that. And we also know that the left-wing media is happy to do it, okay? Because we know that other media outlets do not do that. So we know the leftists want to do it and they want to vilify Israel. But I'm asking you, why is the knee-jerk reaction of Western governments that are supposedly allies of Israel, who should know better, okay? They should know better because many of those leaders have been to Israel. They've spoken to leaders. It doesn't even matter who's in power in Israel. There are delegations that come to Israel. They know very well that Israel is a democratic country with liberal values. So why are they so quick to blame Israel right away? And now, and what we see, for example, Canada, France, the UK, and Australia, all, as soon as the pictures of the New York Times came out, which are false pictures, they said, okay, we're recognizing a Palestinian state in September at the UN General Assembly. I'm asking you, why do the governments want to jump on right away, say, you see, Israel is committing crimes?
So I'll get to that in a moment. I want to go back to the previous point and just tell another story. In this recent war, the one that we're still going through, the BBC ran this human interest story about this. I think it was a 14-year-old teenage girl who'd had to leave her home because of the fighting, and they were following, and she was posting on Instagram. I think you post on Instagram, you don't blog on Instagram, and pictures, this sort of photo diary explaining how difficult it was for her and her family. And it was picked up, with perfect English, of course. And this, it was picked up by the BBC and ran as this human interest story. Look at this girl, she represents the people of Gaza. That's the line of the story. No one asked the question, if she actually said, well, Hamas started the war, why did they start the war and bring all this upon us? She wouldn't be posting on Instagram the next day. Yes, the idea that somehow she's a free individual and she can post whatever she wants is just ludicrous.
By the way, the idea that Israel has completely demolished Gaza and a teenage girl is posting on Instagram, what does that tell you? Yeah. Okay, that in itself, okay, where are the discerning eyes? Whatever she were to write, okay, forget about what she says. And I would like to also point out something that people get really angry when I say this, but I'm going to reiterate it because I've heard it from every reservist I know who fought in Gaza, went house to house at great risk to himself. And the soldiers did this when houses and tunnels were booby-trapped. And also, all the hostages who were released have said, every single house in Gaza that the soldiers entered had weapons, bombs. They had not only entrances to tunnels under babies' cribs, But every laptop found, every pink laptop of a teenage girl had Hitler or Sinwar as her screensaver. So though Israel still makes a distinction between civilians and Hamas, and we always will do that, let's just be clear about the fact that even the civilians, many of them, the idea that somehow they're all just under Hamas's thumb, and therefore now they are under Hamas's terrorist rule. But this is a problem of the Palestinian Authority in general, because they are raised from birth to want to commit jihad against the Jews and Christians, to annihilate Israel. This is how they're raised. And that's an important point also about this business of Palestinian
But
state.
let's make sure our audience understands where we're coming from. I don't think you would deny that there is suffering amongst the civilian population of Gaza. They're in a war zone. They're paying a difficult price. There are many. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of collateral damage. People have been caught up in the crossfire. It's not easy for them. We're not denying the suffering. We're denying, I think, the sort of exaggerated reports, one-sided reports that come out of Gaza. And what we're also saying, and needs to be said, is that it's Hamas's fault. Not only for starting the war, but their tactics of using the population as a human shield, of exploiting, and even, I would say, augmenting Palestinian suffering to use as a weapon against Israel on the international. I want to tell you, though, Ruthie, both of us are old enough, I hope I can say that, both of us are old enough to remember there used to be a dictator in Iraq called Saddam Hussein. And I remember during the Clinton administration, he would bring in Western journalists to children's hospitals in Baghdad, and you would see these poor, suffering children, in their incubators, and they'd be dying from some disease. And the head of the hospital would say, President Clinton is killing these babies through the sanctions that prevent us from buying the medicines we need to save their lives. And then the doctor would say exactly the same thing. President Clinton is killing these children through the sanctions which don't allow us to buy medicine. And then the nurse would say the same thing. And the families, the crying mothers would say the same thing. And it was all orchestrated and produced by the Iraqi propaganda authorities. And when you have an authoritarian regime and you don't have independent civil society, so the head of the hospital and the doctor and the nurse and the families will all repeat the same line. And that is the Hamas strategy. Everyone repeats the same line. In this war, we'd say under a certain hospital, we know for a fact that there is a Hamas command and control center where they are orchestrating and leading and commanding their terrorist war against Israel under the hospital. We would say, we know it's there. And so the journalists in Gaza, of course, would never report it. They can't report it. If they report that, they get into trouble. And on the contrary, they'd go to the hospital and they'd interview the head of the hospital. And the head of the hospital, of course, appointed by Hamas, fears Hamas. No Hamas in my hospital. And all the doctors and the medical staff, no Hamas in this hospital, because it's the Saddam Hussein / Hamas playbook.
You're being too kind to the journalists and the doctors. Okay, it's not just they'll get in trouble. They agree with that, all right? This is not just they'll get in trouble. You realize that in the hospitals in Gaza, they're in Al-Shifa hospital. The head of the hospital is Hamas. It's not just, he fears Hamas. He's one of them.
Right.
And there were hostages killed in that hospital. And another thing is the journalists as well. You're talking about people who ideologically agree with them. And to say, no, maybe they're good people, but they can't say it.
No, I said there were three types.
Yeah, I know, right. You said, and some of them fear Hamas.
Yes.
Yeah, look, everybody fears Hamas. But that doesn't mean that they don't agree with Hamas. It means that they've got to be careful and all that. That's true. But I'm not even talking about that. I was not talking about Western governments that automatically jump to accept the propaganda and then accuse us of that. And that while we are checking our facts. And this has been going on not just in this war. It's constant. And that's why I will say, I know you'll never say that. I will say those are not allies. And at the moment, the only country that counts, let's face it, is the United States. The rest of them, they are themselves falling prey to their Islamist voters. And I'm not saying Muslim voters, I'm saying Islamist. Okay, let's make that clear. because not all Muslims are Islamists. But the fact is, the radical left and the Islamists are joining forces everywhere, including in America. Of course, President Trump is trying to tackle that. But in Europe and in Australia, all that, and that combined with anti-Semitism from the right and the left, you have this perfect firestorm, and it then persuades everybody else. You were going to mention it's persuading private companies to attack Israel.
So I think there's a number of things. What's going on with the Western governments who should know better? A number of things are going on. Number one, it's, as you said correctly, it's internal politics. The issue of Palestine has become this sort of mantra, this sort of holy grail for the left. And so even parties of the moderate left, they've got a more, hard left constituency, and they play the Palestine card, and it makes them, it's a very popular issue for part of their constituency. Same with the Democrats in America. The more radical, the more progressive wing of the party just loves Palestine. They can't do anything wrong, right? In their opinion. You've also got the issue, especially in Europe, less so in America, but even though we saw it in America and Michigan, places where there's a voting bloc, an ethnic voting bloc, a religious voting bloc that wants to encourage, a more anti-Israel position, that's also true. Is it possible in countries like Canada and France, it's a way of distinguishing themselves from America? They can't really attack Trump, so let's just attack the policy on Gaza. But also, and I think we said this last week, but I think I can repeat it because it's an important point. They're irrelevant, right? If there's going to be a ceasefire tomorrow in Gaza or not, if there's going to be a hostage deal, it's the Americans, it's Witkoff, it's Trump, through the Egyptians and the Qataris, and we haven't discussed Qatar yet. These other governments, the French and the British and the Australians and the Canadians, I don't want to tell them, they know it themselves, they're irrelevant if there's going to be a ceasefire tomorrow in Gaza. So maybe it's a feeling of their impotence, their inability to do anything really to try to end the war quicker, yes? So they start being irresponsible. If you don't have any power, you can say whatever you like. And you can sprout this, all these things. Australia recognizing a Palestinian state. Canada calling for a ceasefire, right? Which leaves Hamas in power, of course. It's just words. But maybe it's a function of their own political impotence, which they've forced upon themselves. Had they been more, and it's a problem. Germany was a bit disappointing this week. The Germans announced possible restrictions on weapons and munitions for Israel, and there was a story out of Norway, which was of concern. But there's also a silver lining on that. The Norwegians have the largest sovereign wealth fund on the planet. I think over $2 trillion. And they announced they're going to end their investments in Israel. And that I got it from a friend who I met socially recently who's in the business field, in the high-tech field, and he said to me, it's very difficult today to get investments from Europe, and some Europeans who've been traditional investors are even pulling back a bit. And it's a function of this public opinion generated by the media and supported by too many governments, right? It's more difficult. It's not good, and it's difficult to sugarcoat, though I would say the following. Number one, by not investing in Israel, they're losing money, because Israel's a great place. Just the Israel Stock Exchange has outperformed the U.S. Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange since the beginning of the year. Israel is a good place to do business. But secondly, I would remind them all that France in 1967, just in the lead up to the Six-Day War, ended its arms sales to Israel, and they wanted to hurt us. They wanted, this is de Gaulle's decision, the famous Charles de Gaulle. But actually, he gave us the impetus to start our own indigenous military industry, and maybe he actually in the long term helped us, because by forcing us to make our own arms industry, we can now make some of them, we export to the world. And so we will win this war, I'm confident of that, with or without these critics, probably without, and in the end that's the only thing that counts, winning the war.
No, I totally agree with you. We've got to win the war, and that's the best PR you could possibly have. And, as I said, I've been very skeptical about PR and what Israelis call hasbara all along. We're always accused of having bad hasbara. But I also remember all the years, way before this war, that you would have two panelists, let's say, on a news broadcast on CNN, let's say. And everyone in Israel would say, oh, my God, look, we have this spokesman. He has a heavy Israeli accent, and he's not very good at being on television. And they didn't notice that the Palestinian debating him had a terrible accent and had terrible English. That was okay. Somehow the Israeli always is targeted as the loser. But aside from the PR, I would like to say that we have open enemies, okay? Now, among friends, so-called friends, I call them, I mean, you're much nicer about them than I am, because I have to say that if France keeps that up, for example, I would say, no, they're not an ally of ours. Forget it. And because that's not the behavior of an ally. And by the way, we saw that Secretary of State Marco Rubio, we know now that he also gave a veiled threat to Australia. Australia has been atrocious. It wouldn't even condemn October 7th.
No, that's not true.
There was a statement put out by the Biden administration to ask all these governments to sign on to it. And what it said in this statement was, the October 7th atrocities were, it was nothing since the Holocaust. And it was a statement. It had no weight, but it was a statement that the United States, the Biden administration, not Trump, asked Australia to sign, and it refused. And then it asked them to please assign an envoy for anti-Semitism. And Canberra refused. And it took months and months for it to appoint someone. And what were the grounds? We can't have an envoy to combat anti-Semitism without having an envoy to combat Islamophobia. Now, why am I bringing that up? I'm bringing that up because this tendency among leftists and liberals to say that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are the same. It's all hate. It's all the same. It's universal. It's not. Okay. And in most of those countries, Islamophobia is not a problem where anti-Semitism is. But aside from that, let's take the UN. The Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, just said that because the UN released a report, this is what I'm talking about, equivocation, released a report about Hamas's use of rape, sexual abuse as a tool of war, okay? And it documented it. In fairness to the UN, at least it called out Hamas in this report for its sexual crimes, which we know, especially on October 7th, but afterwards as well. Said, okay, but we also have to therefore censure Israel, write a report about Israeli sexual crimes. And our UN ambassador, Israel's UN ambassador, Dani Danon, fought back against this, bringing evidence that this isn't true, etc. And so Guterres backed down and said, okay, but I'm warning you that by next time we write a report, next year, Israel will be included. He threatened that Israel would be included on the list of countries that use sexual violence as a tool of war. And that's what I mean about you take good and evil and you equate them. That's very dark. Okay. And so you can say, no, they don't mean, you're always kind of, modifying this. They're not bad people. Yes, they are bad people. Anybody who says that is a bad person.
I think there are politicians who are doing this and seeing which way does the wind blow, But let me say the following. One of our major problems is the fact, and I'm proud of it, of course, that we are a democracy. You walk down the street in Tel Aviv with a CNN camera and you ask 10 random Israelis, do they like the government? Are we doing the right thing? And so forth. You'll get 10 different opinions because Israelis are opinionated and everyone's got their opinion, what the government's doing wrong or right. And of course, often a media organization will highlight the Israeli that agrees with their predisposing bias. And so if they're against Netanyahu, they'll find Israelis and amplify those voices. When they're interviewing hostage families, they'll usually interview hostage families that are critical of the government and not the other ones. Same CNN camera crew goes down the street in Gaza and you ask 10 random Gazans, what do they think about the war? Do they blame Hamas? They can't blame Hamas. It's like walking down the street in North Korea or walking down the street in Russia or walking down the street in China. There are strict, they can blame Hamas but then they have to live with the consequences if they think Hamas is still going to run the show when this war is over. In other words, they are not free to criticize. They're not living in a democratic, open, free society which tolerates criticism. And so you have this. You said before, you'll have the Israeli and the Palestinian both with bad accents. Often you'll have an Israeli and a Palestinian, and they'll both agree that the Israeli government's the problem.
Exactly.
Yes.
The Israeli left has become a serious problem because one of the reasons that Guterres was able, or I hate even to say that, but said a warning to Israel about sexual crimes, has to do with the Israeli left. And by the way, the Israeli left has been appalling, especially recently, and that's another topic. But on this specific issue, months and months ago, some leftists doctored a video, spliced a video, making it appear as though, or attempting to make it appear as though soldiers at the Sde Teiman detention camp for Hamas terrorists who committed the October 7th atrocities were actually raping this detainee. And of course, you can't see any rape taking place, but it's somehow hinted at in this video. So it turns out very, very quickly, it turns out that this video was a fake. It was spliced from different, and it wasn't the right date, and it wasn't in Sde Teiman. But before it was investigated, somebody handed that tape over to the leftist, disgusting Israeli Channel 12, and Guy Peleg, who is one of the broadcasters on Channel 12, who loathes Prime Minister Netanyahu. He aired this video and said it's terrible and our soldiers are raping detainees. And once that got out, and it went all over the world, and that was the tape that Guterres was referring to when he said we're committing sexual war crimes, it was proven to be false. But go prove it now. And this is also the fault of our military prosecutor's office that was supposed to, first of all, those soldiers who are arrested immediately for sexual crimes, they were found to be innocent right away, very, very soon after that. And yet the military prosecutor's office was supposed to investigate who created that phony video, who leaked a phony video to Channel 12, and how did Channel 12 dare to air something it hadn't investigated? Speaking of the New York Times, by the way. All right. So when Israelis hand the enemy all this, first of all, lies about Israel, it's one thing if they produce true, inconvenient truths, and Israel is not innocent of inconvenient truths. We are, like all people, all countries. But this is just outrageous. And we've seen, we can go into that another time about all the various internal attacks on Israel. But that points to you that Guy Peleg, who broadcasted this, was he fired? Was he arrested? No. You talk about in Hamas.
Hamas. We have to finish up because we're finishing our time. But I'd like to. Obviously, I didn't like the fact that you see some of this stuff out there and it's just not true. And but I'm still proud of the fact that I live in a country where we don't arrest journalists. I'm proud of the fact we live in a country where there is freedom of speech, where there is freedom of press. I'm proud of the fact that people can stand up and say the most outrageous things about the government. Sometimes their criticisms can be correct, of course. I'm proud of the fact that we are the only democracy in the Middle East. And so though we can, or you can, complain about this or that network, yes, I accept that's part of democracy. And I would say to foreigners, okay, is there a similar opposition group in the Arab world that you follow? What happens is you're reporting from Israel. You get Israel in all our glorious imperfection, left, right, all the criticisms, all the NGOs, everything out there. And yet what you can report from Gaza, or from the West Bank for that matter, is often a censored, as we said before, dry cleaned, a whitewashed view of reality, while Israel is there in all our glorious imperfection every day for people to see. And on that note, I think we have to finish. We've gone a bit over time.
And I am happy to finish. I would just like to say that I don't call it the West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. That was my only correction this time.
See you again next week, Ruthie.
See you again next week.